through the struggle of the bus boycott in Montgomery, I then began to understand that all we were asking was to be treated fairly. My name is James Calvin Carter. I was born in Greensboro, Alabama, June 10, 1932. My father was a minister. My mother died in 1939.
When 29-year-old Mr. Carter was about to fly for the first time, he prayed that the plane might not crash and that he would live through the flight. Little did he know that the prayer would not only lead to a safe flight, but would also lead to the pulpit.
Well, standing at that airport, I was standing up there with my little blue suit on, frightened. A gentleman came up and said, "This is your first flight, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "Yes, I can tell." I said, "How could you tell? You were praying." I said, "I wasn't moving my lips." He said, "No, but I noticed you were praying."
As Reverend Carter got closer to takeoff, he got closer to God.
I had asked, if I get on this plane, will you get me back on the ground? So the Spirit said to me, why would I do that when I've been talking to you and you won't make your mind up to do what I want you to do? So I said nothing, but I went on, got on the plane. At that time, we could easily get bumped. So when I got to Atlanta, we got bumped. And I took then the bus back to Tuscaloosa. In the meantime, when the front end of that bus crossed into the state of Alabama, that question came again. "Now I brought you back where you're bred and born. When are you going to answer?" I still didn't answer. But come that Sunday morning, I couldn't get up fast enough. I got my bath, I got my breakfast, showed up at church, got to church. A gentleman was leading prayer service. He beckoned for me. I went to the front. He wanted me to join him. So I did, in fact, join him. He sang a hymn. He read a scripture. Then he prayed, sang another hymn, and then he looked over at me. I got down on my knees to pray. I guess I got through maybe 3 sentences. I'm not sure how many. But I remember getting hot, so I reached up and loosened my tie. And the next thing I knew, I said, "Yes, I'll go preach." Now, after that, I don't know what happened. But I have 2 nieces who were in the church that morning, and they claimed that I walked benches. Now, whether that happened or not, I don't know. But I came to myself, looking out that door. It was the brightest day I'd ever seen. If I had to get up to run, I felt like I could run and never get tired. So at the end of that episode, we got finished with the devotion. I asked the congregation, would they let me do my initial sermon that day? Say, "Well, you aren't prepared." I said, "Oh, yes, I am. Oh, yes, I am." So, "Well, how do you know?" I said, "I am." I said, "This is what my text is. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God." I said, "I want to ask you this question. Do you know this God?" Thereafter, for 55 years, then I've been going in and out of pulpits.
Many who grew up in the segregated South remember the first time that Jim Crow slapped them in the face.
I think the greatest impact on Jim Crow on me happened at the Southside drugstore down at the AGS Depot. There was a gentleman who worked there whose name was Walter Reed. He had a glass eye on his left side. One day, hot August day, I walked in the drugstore that had a soda fountain, and I saw this inviting sundae, banana split sundae, and I offered to buy one. And this gentleman turned to me and he said to me, "Nigga, you can't buy no sundae." Well, at that time I knew I couldn't talk back at him, I just dropped my head and walked on out the door. That was my first real experience at what may be called Jim Crowism that really impacted me as an individual.
When young James Carter was 12, he went to work in Cohen's shoe store, where he would learn an early lesson about what it meant to be a black employee in the South.
In that store, I was blessed in that I learned a lot. There was a gentleman who was a boy, maybe 2 years older than I was, who came from Pascagoula, Mississippi. Oh, he's now deceased. But on a given day, I found out Thomas was being paid twice as much as I was being paid. So I asked Mr. Cohen about it. He took me back to the shoe department, sat between myself. I was on the right-hand side, Thomas was on the left-hand side. And he said, "You asked me about your being paid less money than Thomas being paid. Don't you know it costs more money for Thomas to live than it does you?" I said, "Are you sure of that?" So sure, "I'll show you. Thomas, what did you have for lunch?" He went across the street over there to Gourmet Restaurant, and he had a full course meal. Then he asked me, what did I have for lunch? I told him I had a hamburger and an RC. I said, "Now, don't you think that I could have enjoyed a full course meal rather than a hamburger and that RC?" He looked at me. He didn't give me an answer then. Later on that day, he came back to the shoe department and he said to me, "James, I can't pay you what I pay Thomas. If I did, these folk would burn the store down." He said, "But I'll tell you what, I'll pay you what I pay Thomas, but I won't run it through the books." Well, that's fine with me, although I was being cheated in the sense that I did not get credit for Social Security. But for me, it didn't make any difference with me at that point in time. But I worked for this gentleman, and they were very kind. There were so many things I learned.
African American people were often held to a higher standard than white people. This would be another lesson James Carter would learn in a shoe store.
There were gentlemen who had worked at Central Foundry. They came into the store smutty and dirty. And Thomas walked with me and said, "Now, do you think I want to sit next to somebody that's smutty and that dirty?" I said, "Thomas," I said, "do you know why they came in the store smutty and dirty?" I said, "They don't have cars. They don't even have bathhouses out at Foundry as other folk have out there, so they have to come this way." But then the next week, in walks a family, white family. The gentleman had on a pair of Liberty overalls, and you couldn't even recognize the name for the snuff spit. In came the wife. She had on this smutty apron that had, and here these two little stringy-haired kids with them. And I said, "Come here, Thomas. Do you think I want to sit?" Now, tell me, I said, "Do you think I want to sit next to these folk here?" I said, "But they don't have any excuse." I said, "I tell you, they don't have an excuse because they've been free all their days."
Reverend Carter had never known anything but Jim Crow until a train came through Tuscaloosa, the Freedom Train. The purpose of the Freedom Train was to teach liberty and justice for all, and this time Jim Crow would not have a ticket.
The one thing that impressed me was that they had the requirement that first come, first serve. If you were black and you got in front of that train first, you got on board first. And if you showed up, whatever time you showed up, whoever was in front, white or black, they followed you on train. But then I also said the other night that following that very night that the train left was the first time I ever saw Klansmen. And they were marching downtown Tuscaloosa, those who were on horseback and those who were on foot.
The train brought lessons of freedom to Tuscaloosa. When the train pulled out of town, the Klan thought it was time to teach another lesson, a refresher course in segregation.
I was inside the station, and I heard horse hooves. I wonder what it was. And by the time I got to the door, there were several people who almost ran over me coming into the building. When I got out there, I saw these hooded fellas out there. No, I didn't go back in. I wanted to see if I could recognize some of them. And then along come the horses, and I said, well, that very night, when we caught the bus and got to Alberta City, because he lived on Fifth Avenue, Piney Grove Church, the church I mentioned to you, my father at one time pastored, they burned a huge cross right near that church. It didn't frighten me nearly as much as I thought it might have, because, but that was my first experience with Klansmen.
The Cohens were good to young Mr. Carter, but one day, following an accident with a mule, young Carter learned that even the Cohens were not completely colorblind.
On a given weekend, that an old gentleman who was driving or riding on his one-horse wagon, limited lighting, and the squad car happened to have struck this vehicle, and it injured the fellow. It didn't kill him, but I'm overhearing the conversation as she talked with Mrs. Ethel about the accident. So she came back to the shoe department where I was, and I asked her about the accident. And she looked at me and she says, Bill was driving the squad car, and he hit this wagon that this darky was driving. And all of a sudden, she froze when she said darky, because it dawned upon her that I'm talking to a darky. But I tapped her on the shoulder and said, that's all right, because I understood, the culture that was just said, so I wasn't insulted by it. But when she had that conversation with me, I recognized that prior to her really citing the driver of that wagon, she had never really seen me as black, which, that also freed me. I worked that whole summer saving my money because I was making applications to Alabama State. He pleaded with me to stay on at the store. And I said, no, Mr. Cohen, it's my time now to go on and go to school. So I left and went on to school. But the store here back in Tuscaloosa remained open until 1954. So my freshman year, I'd come home on weekends. He'd pay my bus fare from Montgomery here, my bus fare back. Then he'd pay me well for working that Saturday and sometime in the evenings. And then early Sunday morning, I had to take the bus back. But he'd pay me, that ran through the books. But when we got to the bus station, he'd always put another $25 in my hand. So, I was grateful for how well they looked after me over time, because my life was enriched because I had that experience.
African Americans could be employed as janitors or stock boys in the downtown stores, but never as a clerk or cashier. One day the white cashier needed Mr. Carter's help with the register.
Well, when the time came to ring the sale up, she called me to the register. I went to the register. I rang the sale up. I counted the change back to the clerk, not to the customer. And when I finished counting that money back to the clerk and stepped out of the little register box, The lady says, "What that doctor doing ringing that register?" So the lady turned and said, "Lady, that boy know more about this store than the owner. Didn't you hear me ask him to help me find these shoes?" Say, "Well, how come he won't teach you instead of teaching that doctor how to run the register?" She came back to me, sat down, and apologized. She said to me, "James said, I'm sorry that that lady spoke like she did." So I said to her, I said, "Well, that's all right. I understand that." Now, those were two people. The lady who came to the ministry department, this young fellow Thomas, whom I had complained about making more money than I was making. I was able, at that point in time, to come to realize that all white folk aren't evil. And from that, I was able to purge myself of any of the hatred that I might have had toward white folk.
Reverend Carter would learn another lesson about all white people not being evil while driving through Anniston, Alabama one Sunday morning, listening to the radio and the sermon of a white preacher named Phil Noble.
I was on my way down South Anniston to go to church that morning, and when I got on Quintard, he was up to preach. He took a text from Acts of the Apostle, and he said, "Well, I'm reading this text this morning from the Apostle Paul, wherein he said, I'm a citizen from a city of no mean report." And he said, "I wish to God that I could say the same thing." And I parked my car. I had to sit there and listen to that sermon down to its end. I said to myself, I don't know whether he's going to have a job come Monday morning. And sure enough, that Monday morning, a moving van was at that parsonage. But he said this, that I wish I could say the same thing that Paul said, because on Mother's Day, we had this violence downtown at our bus station. And he went on to say that this sort of thing need to be corrected, that the people were only seeking to be treated justly and fairly. From that experience, through all the struggles of the civil rights movement, I have said this to myself over and over again. Had anybody told me that we could have accepted the fact of people living and sitting together with as few deaths as there were, I never would have believed it.
The South was completely segregated in a mean and cruel way. But when America defeated Hitler and the war was over, young Carter saw the unity and compassion of the human spirit shine through.
When word was circulated that the war was over, folk came out of stores everywhere, black and white, dancing and hugging each other. They were so glad that that war was over. Didn't think about color at the time. It's a strange thing how it is that when we are going through a crisis, we can forget about our differences.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
I know that there is goodness in humans, no matter what the texture of their hair or the pigmentation in their skin. And I also know this, that every positive movement for bringing about civility in this nation in terms of racism, it has always had in its place some well-meaning white folk. There was no way that we could have gotten it over had there not been this. So therefore, I accept people on the basis of their personality and don't worry about a group.